How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Take a Wild Guess, the show where I tell you the story of an object, a place, a historical event, or a name, and you guess what I'm talking about. Now, today's episode is called Contrapunto. I know this is a fancy sounding title, but the word is just Spanish for counterpoint. Today's story is about a punctuation mark, probably the most dramatic and controversial punctuation mark in history. And of course, it is one that all of us have seen before. So, do you know what I'm talking about? If not, listen on. Maybe you will figure it out by the end of today's story. And even if you don't, you can always take a wild guess. So, let's begin. Now, before we begin today's episode, I have an announcement to make. This is the 15th episode of TAWG, and it is also the last episode of season 1. A quick story for you. I first thought about this podcast when I was drunk with my best friends, and it sounded like a good idea when I was drunk. So I'd never expected it to actually take off. But thanks to your overwhelming support and encouragement, it is now a big part of my life. Okay, so now the emotional part is out of the way. Let's dive into our story. Okay, I know. You are probably thinking, why am I making the last episode on something as lame as a punctuation mark when there is such a huge list of topics that I could still cover? Especially when I still haven't got around to that sports episode I promised last week. But believe me, when I started researching for this story, I had not expected it to be so much fun. So I thought I just might share it with you. The history of this symbol is so interesting that American author Cecilia Watson has written a full-length book about it, something that she calls the book's biography. And a large part of the content in today's story is borrowed from her writing. Watson calls this symbol a place where our anxieties and our aspirations about language, class, and education are distilled. Okay, that is a bit dramatic, but nevertheless, it is still pretty cool. Now, most of these stories were born because there is such a strong debate about how to use and how to interpret this symbol. And as you can imagine, if it is used in something serious, like, laws, like writing laws, a misinterpretation can cost lives. Sample this, okay? After the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials were held, where the Allies basically prosecuted the Nazis, right? Now, to decide on the punishments, they referred to something called the Charter of the International Military Tribunal. Okay, this is basically kind of an international constitution which details all of the definitions of war crimes. So, one of the sentences used this punctuation in it. Now, this caused ambiguity in the meaning of the definition, and it actually threatened to halt the entire prosecution process. Spoiler alert, they clarified it soon, and the Nazis were prosecuted. Another example is from America, where in Boston, an early 20th century liquor law was retranscribed a few decades later. And in this retranscription process, this symbol crept in one of the clauses. This resulted in ambiguity, and it led to liquor service getting suspended for 6 years in Boston. That's pretty unfortunate. In fact, in 1837, two French law professors decided to settle a debate over its interpretation by having a duel. Crazy, right? Now that's about the law part of it, but this punctuation even has some social story attached to it. The punctuation has a feminist angle to it. While feminist authors of the 20th century like Virginia Woolf used it extensively, many male authors, even the likes of Hemingway, avoided it. A very dramatic example is as follows. The grammarian James Fitzpatrick called it the most pusillanimous, sissified, utterly useless mark of punctuation ever invented. Now, for those of my listeners who don't know, sissified is a derogatory term with a homophobic context, and pusillanimous is the root word for another expletive, which is today used to denote a coward, a cat, and a woman's private parts. However, in the 21st century, the punctuation mark is anything but useless, and it has found use in two major fields other than literature. The first is computer science. In the ultra famous programming language C++, it is used to denote the end of a command. A fun question for you here. Guess which former engineer turned podcaster once spent 6 hours trying to debug his code only to find out that it was because he had missed one of these punctuation marks. The second application is in mental health and suicide prevention. Over the last decade, it has become a metaphor for not giving up. It is the logo of an international movement whose slogan goes, "It represents a sentence which the author could have ended but chose not to." The author is you and the sentence is your life. Quite moving, I know. Many people who have struggled with these issues get this symbol tattooed on their wrists. Even Selena Gomez has one. Do you know what we are talking about? Even if you don't, take a wild guess. The answer, of course, is the humble semicolon. That brings us to the end of this episode and this season. But remember, it is just a semicolon, not a full stop. We will be back soon. When you ask, well, why don't you take a wild guess? If you like this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. If you have any comments, criticisms, or feedback, please write to me at tawgpodcast@gmail.com or message me on our Instagram handle. Till next time, I'm your host Chaitanya Ganu and this is Take a Wild Guess.